In 1955, on a crowded bus in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks was told to stand so a white man could sit. Her quiet, firm refusal didn't just break a local ordinance, it shattered the silence of a nation and ignited a fire that would reshape the American landscape forever. Imagine a country where the simple act of drinking from a water fountain or sitting at a lunch counter was a political statement of life and death. This is the story of a second American Revolution, a decades-long struggle of blood, faith, and unyielding courage that challenged a superpower to finally live up to the promise that all men are created equal. The roots of this movement didn't begin in the 50s, but long before, in the unfulfilled promises of the post-Civil War era. After the abolition of slavery, the short-lived period of Reconstruction offered a glimpse of a multiracial democracy, but it was quickly strangled by the rise of Jim Crow. These were not just social customs, they were a rigid legal caste system designed to re-enslave Black Americans through segregation, disenfranchisement, and terror. For over half a century, the South was defined by signs that read "white only" and colored, symbols of a deep-seated effort to deny the humanity of millions. By the time World War II ended, a new energy was pulsing through the Black community. Hundreds of thousands of Black veterans returned home after fighting for freedom in Europe and the Pacific, only to find themselves treated as second-class citizens in the very country they defended. They had seen the world, they had tasted a measure of respect abroad, and they were no longer willing to accept the indignity of the back of the bus. This generational shift, combined with the growing influence of the NAACP and the legal brilliance of figures like Thurgood Marshall, set the stage for a legal showdown that would change the classroom and the courtroom. In 1954, the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education delivered a thunderclap. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal had no place. Separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. While this was a monumental legal victory, the reality on the ground was far different. White resistance crystallized into a movement of massive resistance, leading to the formation of white citizens' councils and a resurgence of the Klan. The law said schools must integrate, but the hearts and minds of those in power remained locked in the past. The true heartbeat of the movement, however, moved from the courtrooms to the streets. The Montgomery bus boycott taught the world the power of nonviolent direct action. For 381 days, the Black community of Montgomery walked, carpooled, and organized, refusing to fund their own oppression. Out of this struggle emerged a young, charismatic minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. Drawing on the teachings of Gandhi and the social gospel of the Black church, King provided the movement with its moral compass, arguing that love and nonviolence were the most powerful weapons available to an oppressed people. As the 50s bled into the 60s, the movement took on a new youthful urgency. In 1960, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter and asked to be served. They were denied, but they stayed. Within weeks, the sit-in movement spread like wildfire across the South. These young activists faced physical assault, verbal abuse, and arrest with a calm dignity that horrified the nation when it appeared on the evening news. This led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which brought a grassroots community organizing focus to the struggle.
The stakes continued to rise. In 1961, the Freedom Riders challenged the segregation of interstate bus travel. They were met with horrific violence in Alabama, where buses were firebombed and riders were beaten by mobs while police looked the other way. The images of charred buses and bloodied activists forced the federal government to intervene, marking a recurring theme of the era: local activism forcing federal action. Each time the movement pushed, the system pushed back with brutality. But the world was now watching. The year 1963 became a turning point. In Birmingham, Alabama, often called the most segregated city in America, Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on child protesters. The sight of children being bowled over by water cannons shocked the conscience of the globe. From a dark jail cell, King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, articulating the moral necessity of breaking unjust laws. This momentum culminated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to hear King's "I Have a Dream" speech, a vision of an America where character mattered more than color. But for every peak, there was a valley. Just weeks after the march, 4 young girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The path to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and a Voting Rights Act of 1965 was paved with the blood of martyrs like Medgar Evers, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and the 3 civil rights workers murdered in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. The struggle moved from the right to sit at a lunch counter to the fundamental right to vote, leading to the bloody Sunday Bridge in Selma, where the nation saw peaceful marchers beaten by state troopers. As the mid-60s approached, the movement began to fracture and evolve. In the urban North and West, poverty, police brutality, and systemic neglect led to a different kind of frustration. Leaders like Malcolm X challenged the philosophy of nonviolence, emphasizing black pride, self-defense, and economic self-sufficiency. The cry for black power began to resonate, reflecting a desire not just for integration into a broken system, but for the power to define one's own destiny. The movement was no longer just about Southern laws, it was about the very structure of American society. By the late 1960s, the geography of the struggle shifted from the dusty roads of the South to the concrete canyons of northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Newark. While the Civil Rights Act had ended legal segregation, it had not touched the deep-seated economic inequality, redlining, and housing discrimination that kept Black Americans trapped in decaying urban centers. Dr. King himself moved into a dilapidated apartment in Chicago to highlight these conditions, finding that the northern brand of racism was often more subtle but just as deadly as the southern variety. The movement was evolving from a fight for civil rights into a fight for human rights and economic justice. This era saw the rise of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. Founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers represented a radical departure from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They wore black berets and leather jackets, carried unconcealed weapons for self-defense against police brutality, and established social programs like the Free Breakfast for Children program. To much of white America, they were a threat. To many in the Black community, they were a necessary response to a system that seemed unwilling to change through prayer and marches alone. The tension reached a breaking point in 1968. Dr. King had begun organizing the Poor People's Campaign, an ambitious plan to bring a multiracial army of the poor to Washington to demand an economic Bill of Rights. He was increasingly vocal against the Vietnam War, arguing that the resources being spent on bombs in Southeast Asia should be used to rebuild American cities. But on April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, the man who had become the symbol of nonviolence was silenced by an assassin's bullet. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. ignited a wave of riots and uprisings in over 100 cities across the United States. It felt to many as if the dream had died with him. However, the movement did not stop. It transformed. In the wake of his death, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the final major legislative achievement of the era. The struggle then moved into the realms of political representation and affirmative action. Black mayors began to be elected in major cities, and the Congressional Black Caucus was formed to provide a permanent voice in the halls of power. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the legacy of the movement faced new challenges, including the rise of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, which many scholars later termed the new Jim Crow. The fight for equality moved into the workforce, with battles over equal pay and representation in corporate boardrooms. The movement also inspired other marginalized groups, women, the LGBTQ+ community, and Hispanic Americans to use the same tactics of protest and legal challenge to demand their own place at the American table. As we look at the 21st century, the echoes of those 60s marches are still heard in the streets. The emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to modern-day police shootings reminded the nation that the work started in Montgomery and Selma is far from over. Today's activists stand on the shoulders of giants, using social media and global networks to organize with a speed the pioneers of the movement could only have imagined. The history of the American Civil Rights Movement is not a closed chapter in a textbook. It is a living, breathing narrative of a people's refusal to accept anything less than full humanity. It is a story of how ordinary people did extraordinary things, proving that progress is never inevitable, but is bought with sacrifice, persistence, and an unwavering belief in justice. From the back of a bus in Alabama to the highest offices in the land, the journey continues, reminding us that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it only bends toward justice because of the hands that reach up to pull it down.
To truly understand the depth of this struggle, we must look beyond the famous speeches and into the shadows where the unsung heroes of the movement toiled. While history books often focus on the charismatic man at the podium, the backbone of the civil rights movement was forged by women who organized kitchens, led local chapters, and strategized behind the scenes. Ella Baker, often called the mother of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was a force of nature who believed that strong people don't need strong leaders. She pushed for grassroots democracy, teaching young activists that their power lay not in a single messiah-like figure, but in their own ability to mobilize their neighbors. Then there was Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper from Mississippi who was beaten and jailed simply for trying to register to vote. Her testimony at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, where she asked, "Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings," forced the entire nation to look in the mirror. These women faced a double burden of racial and gender discrimination, yet they were the ones who kept the movement alive when the cameras were turned off. The movement was also a battle of optics and technology. The 1960s was the first decade where television brought the brutality of the South directly into the living rooms of the North.
When the peaceful marchers in Selma were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the footage interrupted a national broadcast of a movie about Nazi war crimes. The irony was not lost on the American public. Seeing the blood and the tear gas in high definition transformed passive sympathy into active outrage. It was no longer a regional dispute, it was a national crisis of conscience. The legal strategy led by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was equally meticulous. Thurgood Marshall and his team didn't just walk into the Supreme Court and demand justice. They spent decades building a foundation of smaller cases, chipping away at the separate but equal doctrine, one brick at a time. They documented the psychological damage that segregation inflicted on children, using the famous doll tests to prove that black children were being taught to see themselves as inferior. This wasn't just about where someone sat or went to school. It was about the systematic destruction of the human psyche. As the movement progressed, it also had to contend with the internal complexities of the Cold War. The United States was trying to sell democracy to the world, while its own citizens were being lynched at home. Soviet propaganda frequently used images of American racial violence to discredit U.S. foreign policy in Africa and Asia. This geopolitical pressure gave the movement a unique kind of leverage. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson weren't just motivated by morality, they were motivated by the need to maintain America's global standing on the world stage. By the time we reached the mid-70s, the movement had shifted toward what many called the second phase, economic empowerment. It became clear that the right to sit at a lunch counter meant very little if you couldn't afford the hamburger. This led to the rise of Operation Breadbasket, and later the Rainbow Coalition, which sought to bridge the gap between racial justice and economic reality. Activists began targeting corporate hiring practices and demanding that the wealth of the nation be shared more equitably. They realized that systemic racism was woven into the very fabric of the American economy, from property taxes that funded schools to the way bank loans were distributed. We must also recognize the profound impact of the arts in this era. The Freedom Singers, Nina Simone and James Brown, provided the soundtrack to the revolution. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a tool for survival. In the face of police dogs and fire hoses, singing songs like We Shall Overcome or Oh Freedom provided a spiritual armor that physical weapons could not pierce. It created a sense of collective identity and shared destiny that bound people together across state lines and generational divides.
The legacy of those songs and the courage of the grassroots organizers eventually led to a massive shift in the American political map. When the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law, it didn't just give Black Americans a ballot, it fundamentally broke the white monopoly on political power in the South. For the first time since Reconstruction, Black men and women stood in long lines, sometimes for hours under a scorching sun, to exercise a right that had been denied to their ancestors for centuries. This wasn't just a victory for a single race, it was a victory for the very idea of a representative democracy. Almost overnight, the number of Black elected officials began to climb, from local sheriffs and school board members to mayors of major cities like Atlanta, Cleveland, and New Orleans. This political awakening forced the federal government to look at the more hidden, structural forms of racism that lived in the North and West. We call this the era of institutionalized segregation. While there were no colored-only signs in cities like Chicago or New York, the invisible lines of redlining were just as effective. Banks would literally draw red lines on maps around Black neighborhoods, refusing to offer mortgages or business loans. This created a cycle of poverty and disinvestment that lasted for decades.
The movement responded with the Black Power movement's focus on community control, the idea that black people should own the businesses, the schools, and the land in their own neighborhoods. The 1970s also brought the controversial but necessary battle over busing and school desegregation in the North. In cities like Boston, the attempt to integrate schools met with a level of violence and vitriol that mirrored the worst days of Little Rock or Birmingham. It revealed a painful truth that many Americans who supported civil rights in the South were less enthusiastic when it meant changing their own neighborhoods. This period tested the resilience of the movement, proving that the struggle for equality wasn't just about changing laws in Washington, but about changing hearts in every zip code across the country. As the 1980s dawned, the movement faced a new and devastating challenge known as the war on drugs. Under the guise of law and order, new sentencing laws were passed that disproportionately targeted black communities. The crack cocaine epidemic and the harsh legal response to it led to a period of mass incarceration that tore families apart and stripped millions of their right to vote through felony disenfranchisement. Many activists from the 60s saw this as a calculated rollback of the gains they had fought so hard to achieve. It was a stark reminder that progress is not a straight line. It is a constant tug-of-war against the forces of reaction. Yet even in these dark years, the fire of the movement continued to burn. We saw the rise of global solidarity as American civil rights leaders joined the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Figures like Jesse Jackson ran historic campaigns for the presidency, proving that a black man could mobilize a rainbow coalition of the poor, the working class, and the marginalized. These campaigns laid the groundwork for future generations, showing that the highest offices in the land were no longer out of reach. The movement was no longer just about survival, it was about leadership and the power to set the national agenda. The transition into the 1990s and the early 2000s brought the movement into the digital age. The 1992 Los Angeles uprising, following the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King, showed the world that the wounds of police brutality were still raw and unhealed. But it also showed the power of the camera. What was once hidden in the shadows was now being captured on tape for the whole world to see. This era was a bridge to the modern day, where the spirit of the 1960s met the technology of the 21st century, leading to a new wave of activism that refused to be ignored.
The dawn of the 21st century brought with it a moment that many veterans of the Montgomery bus boycott never thought they would live to see. In 2008, the election of Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States was hailed by many as a post-racial milestone, a symbolic culmination of the long march that began on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As he stood on the inauguration stage, the presence of civil rights icons like John Lewis, who had his skull fractured by state troopers decades earlier, served as a powerful bridge between the blood-stained past and a hopeful future. It was a moment of profound emotional release for a nation that had been wrestling with its racial demons for centuries. However, the euphoria of that moment soon collided with a harsh reality. A single presidency could not dismantle hundreds of years of systemic inequality. In fact, the visibility of black political success sparked a powerful backlash, revealing that the old tensions of the 60s had merely been simmering beneath the surface. The movement entered a new phase characterized by the realization that symbols of progress were not the same as structural change. While a black family occupied the White House, the wealth gap between white and black households remained as wide as it was in the 1960s, and the shadow of the criminal justice system continued to loom large over black youth. The true catalyst for the modern era of activism came not from the halls of power, but from the tragic loss of life in local communities. In 2012, the killing of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed teenager in Florida, and the subsequent acquittal of his killer ignited a spark on social media that would soon become a global flame. The hashtag Black Lives Matter was born, created by three women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who sought to redirect the focus to the systemic devaluation of Black life. Unlike the top-down leadership of the 60s, this was a decentralized, leaderful movement that utilized the power of the smartphone to bypass traditional media and tell its own story in real time. The movement reached a fever pitch in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, following the death of Michael Brown. For weeks, the nation watched as protesters faced off against police units that looked more like occupying armies, equipped with tanks and military-grade weaponry. The images were hauntingly familiar, echoing the televised brutality of Birmingham, but this time they were being broadcast by the protesters themselves through live streams. This era forced a national conversation on police reform, qualified immunity, and the militarization of local law enforcement. It was a clear signal that the struggle for civil rights had moved from the voting booth back to the fundamental right to exist without fear. The year 2020 became another watershed moment in this long, unbroken chain of resistance. The murder of George Floyd under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer, captured in a gruesome 9-minute video, triggered what many historians believe was the largest protest movement in American history. Millions of people across all 50 states and in dozens of countries took to the streets in the middle of a global pandemic. This wasn't just a black movement, it was a multiracial, multi-generational coalition that demanded more than just reform. They demanded a total reimagining of public safety and justice. Corporations, sports leagues, and academic institutions were forced to reckon with their own histories of exclusion, proving that the movement's reach had expanded into every corner of American life. As we stand today, the history of American civil rights remains a work in progress. We see new battles over voting rights as states pass restrictive laws that hark back to the era of literacy tests. We see the debate over how history itself is taught in schools, with some seeking to erase the very stories of struggle that define the nation. But we also see a new generation of leaders, young, diverse, and uncompromising, who refuse to let the fire go out. They understand that justice is not a destination you reach and then rest. It is a constant state of vigilance. The story of the movement is the story of America's attempt to close the gap between its stated ideals and its lived reality. It is a story that proves that as long as there is injustice, there will be those with the courage to stand up, speak out, and march on.
This final chapter of our journey brings us to a profound realization. The American Civil Rights Movement was never a brief moment in time, but a permanent pulse in the heart of democracy. As we look across the landscape of the 21st century, we see that the battlefields have changed, moving from segregated lunch counters to digital algorithms, from bus boycotts to boardroom equity, and from rural voting lines to the struggle against gerrymandering. Yet the core question remains exactly the same as it was in 1865 and 1955. Does the promise of America apply to everyone or only to a select few? We are currently witnessing a historic era where the past and future are colliding. The veterans of the 1960s are passing the torch to a generation that is more connected and more vocal than any that came before. This new vanguard is tackling the deep-rooted issues of environmental racism, where minority communities bear the brunt of pollution, and the digital divide that threatens to leave millions behind in a tech-driven economy. They are proving that civil rights in the modern age means more than just the absence of chains. It means the presence of genuine, unfettered opportunity. But as the movement advances, the shadows of the past are also lengthening. We see a rising tide of efforts to ban books and restrict the teaching of this very history, an attempt to sanitize the struggle and quiet the voices of those who suffered. This reminds us that the most dangerous weapon against progress isn't just a law or a weapon, it is silence. It is the forgetting of how far we've come and how much it cost to get here. To remember this history is, in itself, an act of rebellion. The story of the American civil rights movement is ultimately a story of hope, but it is a gritty, hard-working hope. It is the hope of a people who were told no for centuries and decided to say yes to themselves. It is the legacy of the nameless organizers who slept on floors, the lawyers who worked by candlelight, and the students who stared down mobs with nothing but their dignity. They didn't just change the laws of the United States, they changed the consciousness of the entire world, inspiring liberation movements from Eastern Europe to South Africa. As we close this chapter, we must ask ourselves, what will the historians of the future say about this moment? We are the ones currently writing the next pages. The arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice, but it does not bend on its own. It requires the weight of our hands, the strength of our voices, and the courage of our convictions to pull it down toward the earth. The march didn't end in Washington or Selma. It is happening right now, in our schools, in our workplaces, and in the way we treat our neighbors. But even as one struggle finds its footing, another mystery begins to unfold. While we have focused on the fight for racial equality, another silent revolution was brewing simultaneously, one that would challenge the very foundations of power, identity, and the American family. In our next journey, we will dive into the hidden corridors of the 1970s and 80s, exploring the explosive rise of the women's liberation movement and the secret histories that changed the American home forever. The fight for the soul of the nation is far from over, and the next chapter is even more personal than the last. Stay tuned, because the real revolution is just getting started.